In this video, we're going to examine the episode of the Daily Mail podcast in which Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham interview Danielle Stonier. Danielle was the person who interviewed Lucy Letby on, I think it's 2 of the 3 occasions. I believe that she will have conducted the interviews in 2019 and 2020. I believe someone else conducted the initial interviews in 2018, or certainly the content of this podcast implies that. It's stated on the screen here that Danielle Stonier is a detective constable. Elsewhere it's stated that she is a detective sergeant. This episode of the Trial of Lucy Letby podcast is subtly entitled Questioning a Killer. So I've cut out the first minute because it's just the bits that they repeat in every single podcast. So it begins here with Liz Hull. I'm Liz Hull, Northern correspondent for the Mail. I've been in court throughout. Were you in court, Liz? I don't think I've heard you mention that before. You really should bring that up more often. And have reported on the case as it developed. Then Caroline Cheetham says, and I'm Caroline Cheetham, a broadcast journalist. Every week we've examined what's happened and brought you the details behind the headlines. So in our verdict episode, Caroline continues, which outlined the guilty verdicts in this case against Lucy Letby, we played you a few clips of some of the interviews that we've had with the detectives who have worked on this case for the past 6 years. So in a previous episode, I've already analysed and examined their interview with Paul Hughes, who led the investigation. It seems that there are some other police officers and detectives that they've interviewed, so we may examine that at some point in the future. It seemed like a good time to go through this episode because there have been some new revelations regarding Cheshire Police recently, and no doubt we'll take a look at those in the future as well. So then Liz Hull says, so we've spoken to many of the senior officers from Cheshire Police who were involved in this investigation, and they were kind enough to give us their time and sit down and talk to us about exactly how she was brought to justice. Yeah, they were kind to do that. They didn't do that for reasons of publicity. No, it was just out of the kindness of their heart. Then Caroline Cheetham says, one of the most interesting interviews that we did was with the detective who sat opposite Lucy Letby, questioning her for over 20 hours. Liz Hull, welcome to episode 54, as I mentioned, the subtly titled Questioning a Killer. Caroline Cheetham, so Liz, as we said, and as we know, you were spent pretty much every day in court. Was Liz in court every day? I don't think I've heard that mentioned in this podcast before. You really should bring that up more often. Court 7 at Manchester Crown Court, listening to all of the evidence unfold. One of the most anticipated days in the trial came around 7 months in, and that was the day Lucy Letby started to give evidence in her defence, something we didn't think she was going to do. So, before Danielle Stonier comes into this podcast, there's just kind of some idle speculation between Liz and Caroline. And Liz Hull continues, we weren't sure. You might remember we talked about this on the podcast earlier on. Nobody was really sure whether we should actually go into the witness box and be questioned by her KC and the prosecution KC, but she did. She decided that she would give evidence, and it's fair to say that was the first time that most people, certainly many of the journalists and no doubt all of the public that were watching in court, heard her speak for the first time, and it was really, really intriguing, and we were all interested to see exactly how she would come across. Now, there's a couple of things I could say about this. If I was being particularly harsh, I would say that the extent to which they became intrigued by hearing Lucy speak is quite unhealthy. We have seen throughout this media reporting, both from herself and Judith Morris, the 2 biggest candidates, the 2 biggest culprits, but there are others as well. A real fascination with hearing Lucy and analysing Lucy's attire and demeanour and the way that she spoke, and that all seems quite unsavoury with the benefit of hindsight, and I do definitely hold that opinion. I will say in mitigation here that, I wasn't in court. It's not likely that I will be in court in the future, because if there is, for example, a retrial, then while I would like to be in court, and I suppose I might be at some point, it will really be my job to cover it every day for this channel, which is what I will do. So I probably won't ever be in court seeing Lucy Letby, and if I am, it will be right at the end when it's the verdict, probably. So I will never see her in the witness box. if you had been in court a lot for a lot of days, or even if you'd been in court for a relatively small number of days, I think it's fair for me to say that it's only natural that there would be a certain fascination in seeing the person who is accused of these crimes that we obviously know weren't committed now, seeing her speak and seeing her in the witness box. It does come across here as a bit of an unhealthy interest, perhaps, but I do think it's kind of a very natural inclination. And I suppose I would be interested to see footage of Lucy in the witness box, if I'm honest. It's not something we're permitted to see in this country that doesn't value transparency in any way. But I just feel it's important for me to make that point. Obviously, we enjoy giving Liz and Caroline a kicking, but we must always be balanced in everything we say. And I can understand why it would have been interesting, intriguing, as she describes it. So, Caroline Cheetham continues. But one person who had heard her speak at length by that point was Detective Sergeant Danielle Stonier. She was the officer who spent hour after hour interviewing Lucy Letby when she was arrested, and in our exclusive interview with Danielle, she talks us through what it was like to question someone that she knew could go down in history as one of the worst murderers in modern times. So then Danielle Stonier makes her entrance to the podcast. So I'm Detective Sergeant Danielle Stonier. So as she's introducing herself that way, I assume that's her correct title and was her title at the time. But there is evidence that indicates that she was a detective constable rather at the time of the interviews, and that she perhaps became a detective sergeant later on. Reward, for the great job she did on this investigation. So she was working on Operation Hummingbird, and I've been involved in the investigation since 2018 as a family liaison officer, but also the interviewing officer for Lucy Letby. So Caroline says, so we were really interested to know a little bit more about that whole experience. And Liz says, what was she like in those interviews? She's been quite cold and quite controlled in the witness box, she seemed to us. So it is fair to criticise this. Now, Liz seems particularly fixated on this notion that Lucy was cold, whereas what I would suggest is that she was broken and terrified by this point. I think she's certainly terrified in the police interviews and probably semi-broken even by that point, although she probably still hopes there's an outside chance the police will actually listen to me giving explanations for what has occurred on the unit. Obviously, she was mistaken in that belief. But I think this constant fixation, it's interesting. I don't want to overanalyze this, but it is interesting that it's both Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham, obviously both female journalists, who are both kind of expecting some outpouring of emotion from Lucy. I don't know if Judith used the word cold, but she described her as blank. And I don't know what she was expecting from Lucy, but it is interesting that two female journalists, I think, have been the most kind of damning or judgmental in that regard. And we're going to have a guest in the next few days who's going to discuss this aspect and who's very much an expert in that area, as well as legal matters. So I think when she's quite controlled is a more reasonable statement, but obviously she's been briefed by a lawyer, so don't go around flailing your arms around and being emotional because it's going to count against you. I don't know what they were expecting. It just seems like they're bereft of any critical thinking. I mean, I'm going to assume they acted in good faith and they did the best reporting they possibly could. We don't know if that's the case or not. It's impossible to know. I'm interested to know whether that's what she was like in the police station as well. So we know that she spoke in the same way for the same reasons. But here's Danielle Stonier. I was involved in the interview process for the interviews that took place in 2019 and then again in 2020. So as I mentioned earlier, it seems that Danielle didn't do the initial interview in 2018. And if you look at the very minimal footage, less than a minute's footage that we've been afforded, it's a lady with short black hair, whereas Danielle's got kind of lighter blondish hair. So she didn't do that interview, she just did the two later interviews. Although when we say 3 interviews, Lucy was interviewed 30 times. So she may have interviewed her approximately 20 times. Back in 2019 was the very first time I met her. She was arrested and brought into police custody, and I was actually standing in the custody suite when she was brought in by the arresting officers, and that's the first time I'd seen her in person. I was really thinking about what the next couple of hours and couple of days were going to entail. And obviously you look at a person and think, right, this is going to be the person who I'm going to be spending time with, asking questions and obviously finding out more about her involvement at that time. So I'll just mention again that across all the police interviews, Lucy was interviewed for, I believe it's 23 hours, 48 minutes. It's just under 24 hours of time in total. So I don't have a breakdown of all those interview times in front of me, but we can assume that Danielle interviewed her for approximately 16 to 17 hours. It may be more than that, it may be slightly less than that, but it's going to be in that ballpark. So she goes on to say whether she was involved or wasn't in what she'd been arrested for. And then Danielle says something that I find a little strange. I mean, I'd be interested to speak to police officers about this. I might ask Dr. Steve Watts about this, but Danielle says it was quite surreal to see her in person. So that already indicates to me that Danielle Stonier, I should probably pronounce it, already had a preconceived view of Lucy Letby. Obviously, she knew she'd been arrested. This case had been around in the public domain for over a year, and she's describing it as quite surreal. So she's already, naturally, she's been the family liaison officer, so she's been interviewing all the families, so she's already got a vested interest in this case. She's part of Cheshire Constabulary, who've been building a case for over 2 years at this point now. And really, her response to seeing Lucy Letby in person, if she was being truly professional, and we're all human, and it's difficult for us to be completely objective in any situation, but she should not be viewing it as quite surreal. Her response should be largely neutral. The fact that it's quite surreal, as I say, is indicative of the fact that she already has an investment in a certain position, which has come from speaking to the families, being in the police station, knowing that Lucy's been arrested previously. So in my view, she's not coming into this from a neutral perspective. Then she continues. She'd already been interviewed, so I had watched some of the previous interviews for a bit of experience. So she's even done that, of course. So I could see how she would react in questions. That doesn't mean to say that she was going to present the same again, bearing in mind she already knew by this point what we were investigating, and she obviously knew herself of any involvement that she'd had. Again, I'd say from watching her and then meeting her, it was surreal, to be honest. So I won't labour that point. I've already made that point because she's repeating the fact that it was surreal. So this was something that was quite significant to her. So then Caroline Cheetham says, you said you had your interview head on, but I wonder, how do you prepare for something like that? What's the training at that point? 2019, you knew what you were looking at. You'd had the evidence back from the medical experts to say inflicted harm, so you knew what might be coming. So this is high stakes, isn't it? So, really, the training obviously should be focused, presumably, on establishing the facts. I'm not sure what other preparation would be required. There shouldn't be an emotional aspect to it. You're supposed to be interviewing this person from a position of neutrality and objectivity. You haven't yet decided that you're going to charge this person. Indeed, they didn't charge her in 2019. So there shouldn't be any training necessary. You're there to establish the facts. Obviously, some people would require training in that kind of thing. I accept that, but they're always talking about, you notice this across all the podcasts, they're always talking about this from an emotional perspective. Or how did you cope with this? How did you deal with this? How did you deal with the awful allegations? It's not your job to do that. I understand that we're all human and we all have emotions, but your job is to ask questions that establish the facts. The way you feel about it emotionally is irrelevant, essentially. So then Danielle Stonier responds, so I'm fortunate that with previous experiences with the police, I've interviewed on a number of cases. I've worked on the major investigation team, which predominantly dealt with murder investigations, homicides. So preparation is definitely the key. Now, I just want to mention something about Stephanie Davies, who is a friend of the channel, of course, and Stephanie will come back again in the future. This is just my impression. I would have to ask Stephanie, but she's dealt with 5,000 cases that were deaths, okay? So quite a large number, obviously a lot more than Danielle, I would assume. So she has had more experience, but she always strikes me as being so authoritative and professional and always sticking to the facts and not getting emotionally. I don't think I've heard her make an emotional statement or become emotionally involved in a case. She just wants to get to the truth. That's why she's good. That's probably why she's not working for Cheshire Police anymore. But it's always I've got used to working on this. It's always emotion, and instead of Danielle Stonier should be saying, she should be brushing them away. She should be brushing them off and hand waving them and saying, well, how I feel about it personally and my personal emotion is irrelevant, Caroline and Liz. Completely irrelevant. I'm there to establish the facts and I'm there to be professional. I'm there to ask the questions and I'm there to give Lucy Letby an opportunity to defend herself. There's no, the fact that these are horrendous allegations is irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant. Anyway, let's continue. As you say, we had the evidence come through from all the medical experts, so myself and my colleague, had spent weeks preparing for these interviews. So we read every single statement, we'd looked at all the medical records. So there is a lot of planning that goes into the interviews because it is a really intense process. You're in quite a small room, she's got a solicitor present, although the solicitor never actually says anything. There's 2 interviewing officers. So then Liz Hall says, although she's spoken the first time round, you don't know that she's going to speak the second time round. She could just go no comment like a lot of people do. Part of our planning process is looking at what may happen. So, first thing, is she going to talk? Is she going to answer all the questions we put to her, or is she going to only answer a couple? And as you say, then go no comment, which they aren't really entitled to do, but we as interviewing officers are still entitled to continue asking those questions, even if she chooses to go no comment. One thing I noticed when I was reading this for the first time was she makes this comment of which they aren't really entitled to do. So that may be of no great significance, but I really viewed that as quite a subtle kind of Freudian slip in which she is viewing herself as we the police, and then the people she interviews are they're part of a separate group. It really shouldn't be like that. Again, there should be a fact-finding mission in which you don't view them as they. It's we collectively are participating in an interview. That to some extent indicates that it would be strong to say she'd already decided about guilt, but given everything that's happened, there's a good chance that's the case. But certainly she had a certain preconceived notion and view of Lucy, I think it's fair to say. Because the way we see it is, she may then decide, for whatever reason, to answer one particular question, whatever that could be. It may trigger something for her, or she thinks, actually, I do want to talk to you about that particular area or topic, or answer that question, but the rest of it, I don't want to. So then Caroline Cheetham says, in the experience this particular 2019-2020, she spoke to you. So we obviously have some of the police interviews, and I've been through some of them, and we'll go through some more in the future. We don't have all of the police interviews, and I'm not sure of the chronology of the police interviews that I've yet to go through. So I don't know if we've actually got any from 2019 or 2020, but I think we probably have. If we don't, then we'll never know for sure how Lucy presented, but I'd say it's very likely that she gave a presentation of herself and gave an account of herself that was extremely similar to the interviews we've already seen, in which she doesn't in any way come across as a guilty person, in which she just answers the questions, gives a lot of information, doesn't stumble over any of her words, doesn't seem she's trying to concoct a story, doesn't get tripped up, doesn't contradict herself, and so on. And this is pretty much what Danielle Stonier confirms here. So Danielle Stonier says, she did. Yes, she did. She spoke to us right from the very off, really, from the first question that we posed to her on both sets of interviews she spoke. We know that to be true. We know that she gave very fluent interviews, in fact. And from that point, you kind of think, well, if she's spoken now, she's going to continue to speak throughout. So then Liz Hall says, rather guilelessly, why do you think she spoke to you? That's what I want to know. Well, if you rack your enormous brain, Liz, and think about it, there could be a reason why Lucy decided to answer all these questions in a way that is ostensibly very honest. What do you think that reason might be, Liz? A lot of people facing such serious charges just don't speak to the police, do they? That's because they're guilty in some cases, Liz. Although, also, some of them do know about how to deal with the police and know to give them as little material as possible. But a lot of those people are indeed guilty, and that's why they don't speak, and that's why they say no comment. There's footage of Matthew Folder, who was used to live fairly near me when I used to live in Cheshire, and he committed some horrendous crimes, and you see him in his police interview going, no comment, no comment, no comment. I'm sure he did that all the way through the interview until he realised I have so much evidence on me, there's nothing I can do, and pleaded guilty. That's why people don't answer the questions. If someone is doing the inverse of that, Liz, what can you infer from that using your incredible journalistic powers? And she gave evidence in the witness box, which, again, a lot of people might have been quite surprised by. Again, Liz, why do you think she would have done that? Why do you think they would have put her in the witness box? And then why do you think she answered all the questions? And then why do you think she gave a lot of information? Why do you think she would have done that? You're surprised by it. A lot of people might have been surprised. You're implying that you're surprised. Why do you think she did that, Liz? Danielle Stonier. What we have to remember is, obviously, we're there as interviewing officers, but we're there as investigators as well. And so for me, we're putting the evidence to you, and this is your opportunity to tell us any involvement you've had or not had, So they always make this claim. Paul Hughes makes a similar claim to this in the Operation Hummingbird so-called documentary, promotional film, as what it actually is. And Paul Hughes basically says, Lucy Letby was the person who knew the most about the case, so we had to get her in order to ask her questions. We did, of course, basically barge her door down at 6 o'clock in the morning and arrest her and handcuff her and put her hands behind her back. We didn't have to do that, and she didn't have the legal right to leave. But hey, we just wanted to invite her to the police station. And then the other thing as well, of course, that's significant about this and significant about this comment here is that they discarded everything that Lucy said, other than the very small number of things that they could use against her. So the idea that Danielle Stonier is saying, hey, this is your chance to help us out and let us help you, is rather disingenuous. That's the most generous thing I can possibly say. So it's like if you're saying to me, this is not me, I am not responsible for the allegations that you're putting towards me, and the evidence you're giving me, that is not me, I have not done those things. So this passage is fascinating. Well, do you know what? Okay, tell me what lines of inquiry to follow to prove that you aren't involved. So she's going to expand on this further, but let's just pause at this point. So when I went through the first police interview, I could see they were actually expecting her to explain to them what had happened on the unit. So in other cases, much simpler cases, what happens is a defendant, or an interviewee, not really defendant at this point, but someone that will, if the police get their way, will end up being charged and having to defend themselves. They're looking for an alibi. They're looking for you to say, well, I wasn't there at that time, so it wasn't me. Although sometimes even if you do have an alibi and even if you weren't there at that time, they still charge you anyway, as we know from Malkinson, as we know from Michael O'Brien, who we've had on the channel. And other people who had exonerating DNA evidence. There's too many to go into, frankly. But sometimes, if you do have an alibi, they'll take that into consideration and they'll say, well, this person's got a rock-solid alibi. We obviously cannot charge this person. But in a case such as this, it's totally, completely and utterly unrealistic to expect Lucy Letby to explain everything that occurred on the unit and therefore give herself effectively what is an alibi. She's always going to be in the hospital, so she can't say, I wasn't in the hospital. So instead, they're expecting her to prove, these are her words, prove that she's not involved. They're literally asking her to do something that is impossible. And we've heard Paul Hughes say this, and now we've heard Danielle Stonier say this. It's just staggeringly, ridiculously stupid. It's mind-boggling. How they couldn't see that was impossible, I have no idea, but they are literally expecting Lucy, and then this was passed into the court case. So they took this out of the police interviews, and then Lucy's on the witness box in front of a barrister who's paid hundreds of thousands of pounds to run the case, who's had years to prepare it, and she's not had any of the medical notes, and she's not medically qualified anyway. She knows a lot about neonatal nursing, and she said numerous things that are correct, but they're expecting her to say, right, give us an absolutely uniform, universal, authoritative, exhaustive account of absolutely everything that occurred in the hospital that exonerates you for every single case and explains what happens to every infant, which literally even the top neonatologists in the world can't do because they've all looked at cases individually. It's a joke, and it's an absolute joke, but that is literally what's happened. It's passed from the police to her interviews to the court case. This idea of, okay, Lucy, you're here to help us. Prove to us why you weren't involved. Oh, you were in the hospital. That's a shame. Oh, you can't give us a medical explanation for every single infant. Okay, well, you must be guilty then. I mean, it's just, it can only be described as idiocy. Yeah, so then she goes on to double down on this brilliance. So you kind of make it a two-way thing, really. You know, you're letting them know why we think they may have involvement, but also, right, okay then, if it isn't you, you tell us where you were during these times, or tell us where to go to look for that bit of evidence that would assist in proving your innocence. So, leaving aside the fact that Lucy shouldn't have to prove her innocence, because that's impossible, what's she supposed to do? Tell them to go and look under one of the other nurses' patios? What bit of evidence that would assist in proving her innocence? I mean, what abject stupidity. And so I think in answer to your question of why do I think she spoke, I think she potentially spoke because she gave full accounts in the first set of interviews, which were then put into her more kind of witness statements and in the medical evidence. And I think she obviously wanted to hear that potentially, if she was going to go no comment, oh, this is great. If she was going to go no comment, were we going to disclose further information? I don't know, you know. She's, yes, absolutely. So, you know, we may then be more inclined to say, well, okay, well, you know, such and such a person has said this, you know, will tell us why they would have said that. I mean, that's barely even language. There's only a couple of levels above grunting. So I don't know what the hell you're trying to say there, but I can't even discern the meaning of that statement. But I suppose, obviously, the bit about disclosing further information kind of makes some sort of sense. But I think probably the reason Lucy answered the questions is that you arrested her, as you did on the previous occasion, and you asked her questions, and she was trying to convey her cooperation and innocence to you. Indeed, you did describe her as cooperative. So I don't know what that... It's not even a word salad, because a word salad involves words. So I don't really know what that final statement is all about, but presumably it was supposed to convey something to someone. So then Caroline Cheetham says, then what we said, Liz, from being in court, were you in court? Was Liz in court as well? I didn't realise you'd been in court. I don't think I've ever heard you mention that in this podcast. You really should bring that up more often. And just watching her give evidence is just that calm, not easily rattled. What was that demeanour, and was it surprising? So then Danielle Stonier says, so the Lucy Letby you saw in court giving evidence, for me, was the Lucy Letby I interviewed. Her tone, her approach to answering questions, even so much as kind of the pauses that she gave as well, was very much the same, you know. Some of the evidence of the statements that we were putting to her were really, really graphic and in detail, you know, and for me, the allegations in itself are horrific. So again, we're going to hear Danielle Stonier repeat what Paul Hughes said in his interview, but again, they're expecting her to give a really emotional response. They're judging her emotionally yet again. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. In a way, I'm not that surprised, because stupidity is not that surprising to me at this point in my life. I don't know when it stopped being surprising to me over the years, but there must have been a point where my base level of expectation of stupidity became quite high. But this is supposed to be a police investigator. And she can't seem to understand. The next part is just repeating the ridiculous Hughes comments that we heard previously. But Danielle Stonier cannot see that Lucy's in a state of trauma. She's scared and she's traumatised. She was already traumatised when she was just thrown off the unit. I would be scared. I don't know how I would present. I don't know what I would do. I think I'd give the police a lot less information than Lucy did, but that carries risks as well. They still would have charged me if I'd given them less information, so it would have basically, there's nothing Lucy can do in this situation. If she says no comment, then they'll use that against her. If she answers the questions, they've seemingly used that against her. Well, they have used that against her. If she stays calm as she did, cold, as they described it, calculating as they sometimes describe it, but she's trying to be calm, she's trying to be cooperative. They also did use the word cooperative to describe her. They're using that against her. If she started getting really emotional, as they're about to describe in a second, they'd use that against her as they have with other people. What's she supposed to do? What you were expecting her to do was literally the impossible of giving medical explanations for every infant. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But then she goes on to say, some people would be flipping the tables, throwing the chairs, banging the doors down, saying, look, you need to go and speak to such and such, But she can't do that. She can't go and say you need to go and speak to such and such, because she was very careful in the interviews not to bash her nursing team. She's proud of being part of the nursing team, and she has no reason to suspect anyone else, because indeed there weren't any crimes on the unit. So what's she supposed to do? Yes, it's possible that she could have said, well, have you spoken to my nursing manager? Have you spoken to my managers at work, etc., etc.? But she may just be thinking, really that's the solicitor's job to advise her to do that kind of thing. The solicitors let her down badly, and maybe that would have been a good line of argument. But she just didn't think to do that. She was just answering the questions honestly from her perspective. But as for the flipping the tables, throwing the chairs, and banging the doors, utterly ridiculous. I mean, it's literally preposterous that now 2 police officers have said this in these interviews. Now, that begs the question of whether they had a meeting and said, let's get our story straight before we appear on the Daily Mail podcast. Now, I don't know if they did that or not, or whether they've just had informal conversations and have come to the same ridiculous conclusion. It's very hard to say, but what I can say is that there should be no expectation on Lucy Letby behaving this way, and as if that would be some sort of innocence. Now, what I think I would have done, if I was being interviewed, was from right at the start, I would have been saying, why are you asking me this question? Why are you asking me this? And making it clear, and I would make it clear, I've done nothing wrong, I see no reason for this arrest. I'd be constantly questioning why I'd been arrested, why I was being questioned, why they were asking me these specific questions. That's the best, I think the best strategy you could use, because we don't have the right, she said, you don't have the right to silence in this country, you don't have the right to say no comment. I've mentioned several times this interview with a junkie, I don't mean that disrespectfully, but he's a heroin addict in the United States, and he just says, I'm not saying shit. No comment, no comment, no comment. Get me some candy bars. I'm going to throw up in the bin. It was a horribly humiliating experience for him, but he said, I've done nothing wrong. I've not got to say anything to you. You're not my friends. These are my rights. Get me some Coke. Coca-Cola, he meant. Because he needed the sugar, because he's on methadone withdrawal or whatever, Unfortunately, we don't have the right to do that in this country. So my strategy, as I say, would be to ask questions, but they could probably use that against me. They can use anything against you. So I don't know what she could have done, but what is being suggested by Danielle Stonier here is utterly ridiculous, and I would suggest completely unprofessional. So then Danielle Stonier continues. You know that this is completely wrong, whereas she was calm, she was quite cool about it, and she answered the questions. She was confident, she talked, but for me there was little emotion. So this is classic. But what we have to be careful of as interviewing officers is, you can't read too much into that, because everybody reacts so differently. Yeah, you can't read too much into it, except that you've already made it clear that you did read loads into it, and in fact you would think at this point, having said that, you'd stop talking about the emotion and so forth, but in fact you don't. So then Caroline Cheetham says, as we said before, did she tell you anything or give you anything that you thought, I think they might just have something there? Incredible, isn't it? I mean, it's incredible, this discussion. Like, she actually gave loads of explanations during the interviews, specific medical information, and she gave a lot of explanations for her own conduct. Caroline is still thinking, Lucy should have given an alibi, like, I'm not really a nurse, or I don't really work at the Council of Chester, or I was on holiday for this entire period, or, if you looked under the patio, one of the other nurses that worked on the unit. Danielle Stonier, in all honesty, I don't. Particularly if you're looking at the way she's reacting to hearing the evidence, And particularly this is like her colleagues, that she's worked with have provided evidence and, discussing potentially her involvement in murder. So let's be clear, Danielle. None of her colleagues, apart from the consultants, none of the nursing colleagues, we know you made minimal efforts to really interview nurses, and certainly nurses were basically excluded from the court case, but none of them said anything against her. And she also, we don't know exactly what the police asked her because we haven't heard all of the police interviews. I'm just surmising this from what we know and the interviews that we have seen. But it would be extremely surprising if any of her colleagues told you anything concrete, because we know that the case was passed to you with no evidence, and we know that Dr. Brewery never had any evidence, and we know that it was all based on gut feeling, and we know that it was all based on commonality, and we know that none of the nurses had any suspicions. So what you're trying to imply here is that her colleagues were giving evidence against her that was used in court, but in fact that didn't happen at all. All of the evidence in this case comes from Dr. Evans and his quackery, shall we describe it as. So there's no reason for Lucy to respond to this, and she almost certainly, we can't say with complete certainty, but she almost certainly wasn't asked about this, because there's no reason for her to be asked about it, because none of her colleagues provided evidence against her. So she goes on, and hearing about that, your own colleagues, if you aren't responsible, like, I don't know how I would feel, and for me, you kind of look at her, and as I say, there was just nothing from her. She knew the severity of what she'd potentially been alleged of doing. For me, then you'd then start to feel the walls closing in a little bit. So this is speculation about how she should have been behaving. So I thought you said, Danielle, about 30 seconds ago that you can't read too much into these type of things. Do you remember that? So let's just move on. Liz Hull. She knows that you haven't got away and thought, oh, there's nothing in this. You're arresting her a second time, then a third time. Yeah, what was she like the third time? Danielle Stonier. When you get to this kind of charging point, you have to read out, obviously, the date, the baby that's involved, the allegation, and then you read out the acting section. So imagine doing that on 22 separate occasions, and after each one, she has to acknowledge the charge. You have to stand up and listen as these are being read out. Liz Hull said a lot of people crumble to the floor, do they? So we're getting away. I thought we're going to be getting away from the emotions. Remember, Danielle Stonier. So you see all kinds of emotions. You do have people whose immediate natural reaction is to cry. The natural thing to do is to cry, and then it becomes uncontrollable. You have other people who almost just put their fingers in their ears and just completely ignore it and show no interest in it whatsoever. It's the same Lucy Letby we've seen. It's the same Lucy Letby. She has this ability to mentally switch off. Based on what? Are you sure? Are you sure that's the case? Are you sure she was not just very, very forlorn and very scared? I have got to say these interviews with Lucy Letby have been nothing like I've ever interviewed for before. Nothing, I think it was intense. I think it was challenging at times. I think I certainly felt the pressure, because for us we have to remain confident, calm. We have to remain particularly focused, And as the amount of time goes on, you naturally become more weary, Your adrenaline is pumping, oh God, throughout the whole time, because with every answer she gives, your mind's ticking well, where am I going to go with this next question? And then also you're thinking, okay, how is that going to fit into the investigation? What later down the line does that give us some more lines of inquiry to do? Does that help prove or disprove her involvement? So let's just reflect for a second. We're 12 and a half minutes into this interview, which is halfway through. We've not heard anything of substance at all yet. Nothing. We're supposed to be hearing about what the police interviews were like, and Danielle Stonier is now supposed to be downplaying the emotion involved. Now, we know Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham are simply incapable of doing that, but it's quite a lot like the Operation Hummingbird film where, we're going to show you all the evidence. We're going to show you all the evidence on which we convicted Lucy Letby, and then obviously the film, as we know, is total crap. This is not a particularly convincing interview, I think it's fair to say. So then Liz Hull says she killed 3 babies in a fortnight in June 2015, and people started asking a few questions. So let's just assume for the sake of argument that she genuinely believes that. But nobody put 2 and 2 together, really. Except we know that's not true because we know that Dr. Breary was looking at commonality, was pointing the finger of suspicion at Lucy. I think it's fair to say from June 2015, but certainly from July 2015. And then as the year went on, more and more babies started collapsing, and there was a bit of suspicion about her, but she wasn't ever pulled to one side and said, "We've noticed you're on duty every single time." Well, I mean, that would have been a disciplinary offence if anyone had done that, seeing as they had no evidence, Liz. So, who knows what she was thinking. And I actually think afterwards, when she's moved into the admin role, she has the gumption, the bravado almost to put in a grievance. So let's not be too hard on Liz for saying that, because if she was a genuine murderer, then it would be bravado and gumption. Of course, you can infer from this, just as you can infer from her demeanour, just as you can infer from her answering all the questions, just as Liz is never able to conclude that something doesn't quite add up. Something doesn't quite add up about the fact that she has the quote-unquote gumption bravado to put in a grievance procedure. Of course, as we've concluded on this channel previously, that's indicative of innocence. But also, we know the police should have investigated this. They should have been questioning the motives of the consultants. This should have appeared in the court case. That's a mistake by the defence to some extent, because the grievance procedure was mentioned, but it was skipped over to a great extent and wasn't contextualised properly. But certainly the police should have been investigating this, and they should have been questioning the consultant. So let's see what Danielle Stonier says about the grievance procedure. What you've got to remember about Lucy Letby, and we've seen that in the text messages and the Facebook messages, she was at the time a valued member of staff. She was in the thick of it all the time. She was receiving praise, by her colleagues. Families appreciated her time and help looking after their babies. She was always in a position, if somebody had phoned in sick or they needed extra shift covering. It seems to me that Lucy Letby was somebody that you could go to and you could be sure that she'd turn up and she'd be available. And I think all of this gave her the confidence and that she was a valued member at that time of the team. So this is rather speculative, Danielle. Of course, another possible reason why she did this is because she was highly aggrieved by the fact that she'd done absolutely nothing wrong and she'd been thrown off the unit, therefore, for no reason. Caroline Cheetham continues, "Well, actually what you've just described, which is the most ironic thing when you think about it, is that she was a safe pair of hands for them." And Danielle Stonier says, "Yeah, but with that safe pair of hands comes opportunity." Yeah, of course. I mean, that's the natural thing to conflate that with. It's that thing, isn't it? You get away with something for so long. Do you become more confident in the acts that you're doing in that situation? You trust them completely? Yeah, absolutely. So, well, I'll let her make a next statement before we continue. "You would never suspect that your colleague was harming babies, particularly in a neonatal unit. Every parent that entered that department is vulnerable. They're entirely in the hands of those staff, the professionals, and they take it for granted almost that they're going to have their best interests at heart and they're going to help their baby as much as possible. And at the time, Lucy Letby was going to be that person." So incredible that we're supposed to be hearing about the police interviews. We're supposed to be hearing some sort of forensic information about what these interviews were like. It's just pure speculation, emotion, and comments about, what Lucy Letby's demeanour was like and how she wasn't emotional enough and how she should have been banging on the table and all this other stuff. Bear in mind that Danielle Stonier knows naff all about neonatal nursing and naff all about neonatal units. But she's talking as if it's easy to just bump off a load of infants. As she said, 22 charges. It's easy to just attack 22 babies without anyone ever seeing anything. There's just no basis to say that. It's preposterous, again, that she's saying, oh, they all trust her, so she can just basically do whatever she wants, and no one's going to suspect anything, and no one's going to see anything. Ridiculous. Then Liz Hull says, "The parents are bad enough, but also the members of staff that, have to carry on working and have to carry on providing treatment for these babies now, but also the same members of staff who saved so many of these babies' lives as well. How traumatic." Danielle Stonier, yeah, it's horrific. It is absolutely horrific. And you do have to feel for her colleagues. they must feel that their trust, their judgment as well, because they would never suspect anything. You know what I mean? They may think, I'm quite a good judge of character and I've got trust and confidence in my colleagues. And particularly a lot of those times, we've heard the evidence of collapses and, when resuscitation is involved. And I dread to think what the atmosphere must have been like in those nurseries when they are resuscitating a baby. It must be horrific. And everybody's got a role in pulling together and working. Lucy was in the thick of it. And the thought that she put that baby in that position in the first place, but then was in a really key role in trying to revive them, is distressing. So remember, we're getting away from the emotion. Obviously, what they're saying is true. If you're resuscitating a baby, it is horrific, and there certainly would have been problems for people on the unit in the aftermath of the conviction of Lucy Letby. That's undeniable. This has nothing to do with what you've been asked to come into this podcast and do, which is talk about Lucy Letby's interview. So we should be hearing some constructive information about those interviews and about how you interviewed her and about how you assessed the information that she provided and about how you came to the conclusion that she was guilty and so on. Not just kind of random speculative statements about what it's like working on a neonatal unit, which you know nothing about. So then Liz Hull says, because, it took some of them a long time to accept that she was responsible because they just didn't want to believe it because she pulled the wool over everyone's eyes. So, as I've said, Liz loves to stick to the official narrative, but firstly, that's not true. We know, and Liz may not have known this at the time. Let's give her that defence. But we know that they came to this conclusion very, very quickly, firstly. And then secondly, it's important to emphasise, many of them do not believe today that Lucy Letby is guilty. The people that know her best, the people that work closely with her, none of them suspected anything, none of them saw anything. And if they hadn't have been through an enormous amount of pressure because of what has occurred, I'm sure that most, if not all of them, would believe her to be not guilty. As it is, several of them believe her to be not guilty. So the way that this is being presented here, that they all universally believe her to be guilty, is not true. So then, this is very strange because we just go into more speculation here. But Danielle Stonier says, for me, Lucy Letby is quite indescribable. I mean, you weren't asked to describe her. You were asked to talk about something completely different. But anyway, I would say that if you were to walk past her in the street, there's nothing distinctive about her. What does that tell you, Danielle? She's cooperative in the interviews. There've been so many red flags even just in this short podcast that should be telling you. It should be telling you as a police investigator. That should be telling Liz Hull as a supposed journalist that there are red flags about this conviction. But you never managed to see any of the red flags. For me, she wouldn't particularly stand out. And again, is that why she allowed herself the opportunity to have done what she's done, because she's kind of blended in so well. She's blended into that neonatal unit, she's made friends with some of the families, the colleagues, and she's always keeping herself abreast of what was going on a day-to-day basis. So basically, she's doing what she'd be expected to do as a nurse. Of course she's blended in, she's a neonatal nurse on a neonatal unit. Of course she's blended into the unit. Of course she's made friends with the families. Of course she's made friends with her colleagues. Of course she's kept herself abreast of what's going on. Those are the basic requirements of being a nurse. Even an incompetent nurse should do that. Even when she wasn't on duty. Like, when she goes, she's supposed to, that's it, I'm off duty, I will now never think about the hospital again, or any of my friends, or anything that's occurred, or the deaths on the unit. I won't think about any of that again until the next time I clock on. Like an automaton, like a robot, like a Vulcan, I will now just switch off like that. And then I'll switch back on when it's my next shift. I mean, that's entirely realistic, isn't it, Danielle? When she was off duty, I'm quite confident you could have said to her at any point, right, what babies have you got on this unit at the time, and who's caring for them? Is that unusual, Danielle? Is that unusual? Did you bother? I mean, it should be. You shouldn't have to check this, really. You should be able to discern this using your own brain. But did you actually ask anyone else? Did you say to anyone else, for example, a nurse that worked on the unit, would you be aware of what babies are on the unit at any given time? You should even be able to infer this yourself from text messages, because you see Lucy discussing this with other nurses. So she's saying, this has happened, this that's happened. Now, what is noticeable about those text messages, Danielle, if you use your brain, is that the other nurses aren't going, what the hell are you talking about? Which baby you're referring to? I can't remember about the babies on the unit. Because they know the babies on the unit as well, because they're professional nurses. Like, how thick are you? She's going to use the word thick in the next sentence, but she was always in the thick of it. And her life was being a neonatal nurse. So, yeah, it's her life. So, of course, she knows about the babies on the unit. We know it's her life. We know she was dedicated. We know she studied hard. We know it's what she always wanted to do. And you have to be dedicated. You have to be dedicated to be any nurse. Arguably, being a neonatal nurse is one of the most challenging positions. I'm sure many would agree it's the most challenging nursing position. It has to be a big part of your life. Words fail me regarding that comment. But let's move on to the next comment. Being proven guilty and being held responsible for one thing, but the one thing Lucy Letby always held is the why, and only she can ever answer that. Yeah, because these crimes don't make any sense. That's why you haven't come up with the answer for it. That's why no one's come up with a motive, because they don't make any sense. And I think that's the most difficult and hard thing for the families to live with, because that is the one thing they want to know is why. What you've got to bear in mind is some of these families initially were thinking, well, is it me? Is it about us as parents, as opposed, yeah, absolutely. Passing in the corridor, I'm not even going to reflect on that because, again, it's just getting understandable that she got emotionally involved with the families, but should she have been conducting the interviews? She hasn't displayed an enormous amount of critical thinking so far in this podcast. So then Liz Hull says, passing in the corridor, you'd be constantly thinking something that you did while you were there. What, I don't know. That's possible, I suppose. Again, this seems rather speculative, but I'm not a journalist, and I know some very good journalists. This is the complete opposite of how I would ever approach anything. The way that they approach anything, Liz and Caroline, it's always from an emotive perspective. It's never from a rational, reasoned, analytical perspective. It's always, let's work out what the emotional or emotive take is on this, and then not just lean into that, but let's discuss that, the complete absence of anything else at all. So if I was approaching this interview, the kind of questions I'd be asking Danielle would be, what kind of evidence did Lucy Letby give, or what kind of answers did Lucy Letby give during her interviews that indicated to you that she was guilty? We're now 2/3 of the way through this. We've not heard anything like that. And Danielle's not given any indication of this. It's pretty amazing, really, but let's just continue. Well, like I say, these parents have been through, a hard time with pregnancy and then obviously labour and then actually giving birth and then realising that your baby's poorly. You know what that must do to your mental state and your emotions, and that's what I mean. It makes you vulnerable. It makes you so vulnerable. And so they're thinking, have I said something to her? Have I upset her? Have I been overbearing? Have I been challenging, I've never even considered that the parents might blame themselves for almost offending her or upsetting her or making her angry, so she targeted their child. I think parents, like you say, are just completely racking their brains as to think why. Why would anybody, I'm not saying even you could take it as far as not even a nurse, why would anybody, another human being, harm a baby? Why would anybody do that? So I'm not going to dwell on this any further because we've discussed this already. So Caroline then moves on to discuss some of the other cases that Danielle has worked on previously. I think you've done 18 years in the force and 10 years as an interviewer, and I know you've interviewed some pretty high-profile, fairly notorious people, as well as Lucy Letby. I wonder whether you could talk us through a few of those. So two that particularly stick in my mind. One is Barry Bennell. He was a football coach working at Crewe Alexandra. He committed horrendous sexual offences. He was a serial perpetrator. There was, a large number of victims involved, and so when he was arrested, obviously his interviews were conducted over a number of days and a number of hours. They were really challenging interviews to do with him. Another one that sticks in my mind is Ian Nord. He was a police officer at the time when he committed, again, horrific sexual offences, and again was a serial perpetrator, a serial offender. And also those interviews, took place over several days, which are hard and challenging. There's a lot of information that you're trying to process during those interviews. You're constantly thinking about the next questions that you're going to ask and weighing up the answers that you're going to get. And are you going to take the interview in a slightly different direction? It does get tiring after a while just because you're so focused and concentrating. So all I would say about that is that it's really tragic for Lucy that she's been bracketed with these people. It's an awful thing for her. This must have been a very difficult thing for her to deal with, and I'm sure it's still difficult for her to deal with now. At least she knows now that a lot of people believe her to be innocent. I know that she's innocent, as much as I can ever know something that I haven't witnessed myself. So it must be dreadful for her to have been bracketed with people who've committed horrific offences, as is occurring here again. So then Caroline Cheetham says, it's intense and it's stressful, and you're constantly, listening and thinking of what's next and what the aim of this interview is. But emotionally, as a human being, you've obviously interviewed some pretty horrible people. Do you just put it in a box? Do you just put your professional head on and then go home and switch off? Or are there ways of dealing with being surrounded by pretty vile human beings? So again, they always lean into the emotion of every situation. They haven't asked her a single question about how did you determine the facts. Not even one question. It's mind-boggling, truly, in my view. Then Danielle Stonier says, I suppose everybody deals with it in different ways and has different coping mechanisms. As you say, when I'm in work, you've got your professional head on there. You're there to kind of do your job, and in particular, you want to do it to the best of your ability. And part of that for me is having the ability to switch on and off. So for me, when I leave at the end of my shift, whenever my day is, it's when I'm driving home. And the moment I walk through the door, I am able to switch off and carry on with my home life. That doesn't always happen, Sometimes thinking you've had long days, and as you say, some of the stuff that I'm dealing with or interviewing over is hard. So you just have to kind of process it and then move on. It isn't always the case, and it isn't always as easy to do, but over the years I've kind of worked out coping mechanisms and strategies, and I do have the ability to do that. And obviously in this case, the Lucy Letby case, she was interviewed for, I think, over 21 hours over 8 days, 3 different times. So it's over 23 hours. So that must be pretty intense and exhausting. Yeah, it was. We were prepared though. We knew that, she was going to be interviewed for a large number of hours. I suppose part of that was depending on how much she was going to talk. If she wasn't going to engage with us or give us as much information as she did naturally, that would have cut the interview process down, but we were expecting to spend a lot of time with her. Planning and preparation is the key for that, but yeah, it was hard, and particularly as we were getting to the end of the process, it was difficult. But your adrenaline and whatever else kind of keeps you going with that, really. So then Liz Hull says, and obviously you played Lucy Letby in the kind of role play in the courtroom, so you almost flipped your role, didn't you? So Nick Johnson-Casey played you, essentially asking the questions, and you were asked to be Lucy Letby in the courtroom for the purpose of the jury, so they could hear her interviews. And she actually didn't really want you there, did she? So we're really delving into speculation, but where are all the questions about, how did Lucy Letby interview? What information did she give that indicated her guilt? How did you, you interviewed her for a very long period of time. How did you go about discerning what was relevant and irrelevant information? Was there anything that you didn't get from her that you wanted to get from her other than an alibi, which you apparently required? What was the things that from you that she said that surprised you? Etc., etc. There's so many questions to ask about the substance of the interviews, and there's so much that she could convey, and basically she's conveyed nothing. So, this is speculative, asking about Lucy not really wanting. She actually didn't really want you there, did she? How do you know that? When we started reading out the transcripts, Danielle Stonier says, it was myself and Casey Nick Johnson who did it. When I very first started reading out Lucy Letby's replies to my questions, if that did feel a bit strange to start with, but it was, it was a long process. Obviously you were there in court, and I was in the witness box for a number of days, and again, it's just having that ability to kind of switch off and do the role and the job that you're there for. Now, something I want to emphasise at this point is that I've analysed the court process, and actually these police transcripts and these reenactments and the police giving various aspects of her interviews as quote-unquote evidence, obviously I use the term loosely in court, that actually lasted for longer. Let me repeat this just so it's clear. That lasted for longer than the medical evidence in the court case. I've analysed carefully the proportion of all the various aspects of the court case, and I'll probably discuss that in a future video. And the police bit lasts for longer than the actual medical evidence. By note, the medical evidence is a relatively trivial part of the court case in terms of the proportion. By far, the longest is interviewing people from the hospital. That's by far. But a lot of the court case is just people from the hospital saying we had no idea what was going on because we're incompetent. They didn't say they were incompetent though. And it was a case of just reading off the transcript. But it did actually take me back to the interviews. You know, when some of the answers that she gave, you know, it did take me back to the time that we were sat in that interview room over at custody. But also it's hard for me because of who was in court. Obviously there were families in court listening to her answers, and as a family liaison officer I'd built up a rapport with some of those families. So for me, kind of playing that role and then hearing the answer she gave, because a lot of it, that was the first time they'd heard this information, and it almost felt like me providing it to them, her answers, her explanation for things, and at times it felt strange. But as I say, as a police officer, you're there to do your role. And as you say, it's my job. It was difficult, but overall it went well. But she didn't want you there. Oh, sorry, so this must be a question, even though the transcript doesn't pick this out. But this must be a question. So we'll go on to that in a second. So what I would say to that particular section is it's obvious that Danielle Stonier had become involved with the families. I mean, she says that herself. She's become emotionally involved with them. So I would question the wisdom of allowing someone that had been involved with the families, and we know, Paul Hughes said, we contacted the families at the first opportunity. As soon as they launched the investigation, they immediately contacted the families, and that may be a police requirement. So that was 2 years previous to her sitting down for these interviews in 2019, over 2 years previous. So she's been involved with her families for over 2 years. But in their wisdom, they think, oh, I know, the best person to conduct these interviews is the person who's been the family liaison officer for approximately, I think it's 28 months at this time. I mean, to me, that's... I don't know if I can use the word incredible anymore, because is anything surprising about this investigation? Is anything surprising about this case? Is anything surprising about the level of incompetence at this point? I'm not sure that it really is, but objectively, you'd have to say getting someone to sit down and do the interviews who's heavily involved with the families is not the best thing if you want to have an objective process, is it? So then there's this comment, this will be either Liz or Caroline, saying, but she didn't want you there. I think she felt uneasy by me being in court. Well, it's fairly natural that Lucy would feel uneasy because she's watching you go over these police interviews. That's a really traumatic experience for her. And she knows all the time that she's innocent. So she's going through the trauma of the arrest. She's going through the trauma of the interviews. She's hearing them being misrepresented to the court. It'll be horrible. Of course she's uneasy. That's an understatement. It'll be a horrible experience. I mean, I wouldn't want to go through that. It would be incredibly traumatic, incredibly painful. So naturally she'd feel uneasy, but it's still speculative because we don't know, because no one's spoken to her about this. And anyway, she goes on. But there could have been a number of reasons for that. Well, I've just explained the reasons. As I say, I interviewed her. I spent a number of days with her, and whether that caused, maybe some flashbacks for her. I mean, it might have done. There's a chance it caused some flashbacks. Whether it took her back to a time of when she was arrested, I don't know, Danielle. I mean, it's a wild stab in the dark that it might have done. It might have took her back to that time, and we can't say for certain that she struggled to deal with. Whether she knew I was the person that was going to read out those transcripts and go through those interviews and give that information to the court, and the families were there, I can only guess that it must have been difficult for her to have seen me and for me to have been in that courtroom. And then Liz Hall goes, Or is it just another part of her trying to manipulate and decide that actually, this is, we really are into the realm of wild speculation at this point, given that you haven't even spoken to her. We don't even know that Lucy was uneasy, but let's just speculate about why she was uneasy and say she was trying to manipulate everyone by being uneasy, although we haven't established this uneasy because we haven't spoken to her. And decide that actually, if this is my courtroom, I'd rather you not be. There could potentially be, yeah, that's possible, Danielle. Yeah, absolutely. Could it be that, as you say, this is her time, the trial is about her, and she felt uneasy about all the people who were in there and the roles, all the parts they were going to play over the 9 to 10 month trial? Yeah. So there's lots of words you can use to describe her, and I know your feelings are very strong about this, about these families. Yeah, we know she has strong feelings. But I wonder from being the person who sat with her for hour after hour after hour, and now in court for 10 months, whether you have formed a view of her. Danielle Stonier says, I don't think I will ever be able to comprehend what Lucy Letby has actually done. I think more and more you think about it, you think of all these babies that she's hurt and that she's harmed, and the grief that she's caused these families. The more you try to, maybe you can never understand it, but the more you try to accept it, it becomes more and more horrific. I guess really, just to think that anybody, another human being could do that, that is evil. What she's done is evil. She's killed people, but not only that, what she's left and the harm that she's done and the upset she's caused to those families is horrendous. So obviously ending on an emotional note there. So I'm going to skip over the remainder as quickly as possible because it's just Caroline and Liz talking a load of crap and talking about the emotional aspects of the case, as they usually do. So Caroline says, so as we heard that Liz, Danielle was the detective who spoke to Lucy Letby probably the most, and as you heard, Lucy Letby cooperated. She wasn't obstructive, she wasn't rude, she cooperated. But what she talks about is that detached way she behaved. Yeah, she talks about the way that she was quite calm in the interviews, and she was quite cool and quite measured. And that's certainly how she came across in the witness box. She didn't break down very often. We saw a few tears when Dr. A came to give evidence in the dock. That was before she gave evidence actually, and then we also saw a few tears when pictures of her house were shown on the screens in the courtroom. But she was pretty calm and cool throughout. So Liz is always talking about her notes that she kept, so she obviously didn't note down the fact that Lucy did cry over babies in the court case. This is just another myth that is circulated that is untrue. And Danielle said that was a feature of Lucy Letby that struck her as, highly unusual because, she's interviewed a lot of serious criminals and there's often a lot of emotion from people. She's interviewed some of the country's worst criminals, Barry Bennell, convicted of abusing young boys involved in football, Ian Nord, a police officer accused and convicted of serious crimes, and Danielle Stonier has sat opposite those people and been involved in their conviction. Her work has helped to convict them ultimately, but interesting then that she described her experience with Lucy Letby as surreal. I think that's true for a lot of the detectives involved in this case. So the reason it was surreal is because deep down in your psyche, in your subconscious, it's telling you that her behaviour is not consistent with the crimes that she has supposedly committed. But you can't work that out in your rational mind because you're not competent enough to do that. That's why it's surreal, because you see a very normal, cooperative person in front of you who is a highly regarded nurse. There's no red flags, and actually the fact that she's not emotional and not behaving in a kind of scattergun fashion points more to innocence than guilt. So everything, there are numerous red flags, and that's why it's surreal being sat in front of her, because you expect to see a person who's a monster. You expect to see something tangible that you can point to, and you don't see that. You don't see any red flags. So the reason it's surreal is because it doesn't make any sense, as I said earlier in the video. It's just that your rational minds are incapable of seeing that. I'm assuming that Liz and Caroline are acting in good faith. I'm sure Danielle Stonier acted in good faith. I'm assuming Liz and Caroline have done their podcast and they're reporting in good faith. I don't know if they did or not, but I'm assuming that they did. If they did, their brains are incapable of seeing what is blindingly obvious. So Liz continues, none of them can quite believe that they have been part of someone that's committed such terrible, terrible crimes. It's easy to look back and criticise the hospital in a way and say, why did nobody pick up on what she was doing? But nobody wanted to believe that a nurse was capable of this. Obviously the police built a solid case against her and they knew that she was responsible, but still, I think they find it hard to understand how someone could have done this. And I think that's why Danielle talks about it being surreal, because Lucy Letby will go down in history as one of the most awful serial killers in modern times. And to think that you spent a lot of time in your work with someone capable of that is bizarre. And I mean the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders in that interview. And of course, she's not on her own. She's got a team behind her, another detective in the room, but obviously she talked about the hours and hours and days and weeks of planning for that interview before she was brought in, and trying to be almost one step ahead and anticipate, what if she says this? Is she going to do this? And what am I going to ask after that? She talks about that quite a lot. Well, actually, she didn't, because you didn't ask her a single question about that, and you didn't ask her a single question about the planning. It would have been really interesting to hear more about that, but all you wanted to know about, how did you feel emotionally? How was Lucy emotionally? How was the whole situation from... That's all you ever ask about. It's embarrassing. Something to say about Danielle Stonier is that not only is she a highly skilled and experienced investigator and interviewer, which we didn't establish at all in this podcast, she's also a family liaison officer, so she's also working with the family. So here, Caroline says something very telling. In this case, she's highly invested. So it's just literally Freudian slip after Freudian slip all the way through it, but they can never see the problems with what they're saying. As I say, I'll assume that they did this podcast in good faith, but they literally just drop clanger after clanger after clanger, like Dr. Evans. So Caroline and Liz now sign off this episode quickly. That's it for episode 55. You can catch more of our post-verdict episodes on Mail Plus or wherever you get your podcasts. And then Liz says you can give us a rating. I really don't think you want me to give you a rating, Liz, to be honest. And you can share the podcast. You can follow me at Liz Hull or send us an email at thetrialoflucyletby@gmail.com. So in conclusion, I'm going to go over 10 themes from this podcast. Number 1, media sensationalism / emotional framing. The podcast repeatedly, almost without exception, foregrounds emotions and demeanour over any meaningful detail about the interviews. The interviewee, Danielle Stonier, is in no way resistant to this, quite the opposite. Number 2, quality of analysis. Liz and Caroline are almost entirely credulous. They engage in wild and groundless speculation and are almost always emotionally focused rather than analytical. Number 3, conflict of interest / lack of objectivity. There are very serious and legitimate concerns regarding whether it's appropriate to have a family liaison officer who had been involved with the families for over 2 years conducting the interviews with the supposed suspect. Number 4, inappropriate interpretation of behaviour and demeanour. Danielle Stonier repeats all the same arguments, all the same mistakes that Paul Hughes made when he was interviewed by Liz and Caroline, and evidently made during the investigation. Danielle is disproportionately focused on the demeanour of Lucy Letby, how Lucy Letby presented, and emotional aspects of the case, even though at one point she claims that as an officer you shouldn't focus on this too much. She recognises that she shouldn't do what she quite evidently did and what she focuses on throughout the entire interview. This would be bad enough in itself, but it seems that everyone from Cheshire Police misinterpreted what was frightened and traumatised behaviour as cold and calculating. Number 5, procedural fairness and evidential expectations. The police once again express here that they expected Lucy to provide an impossibly exhaustive medical explanation or alibi, even seemingly expecting her to point the finger of suspicion at someone else. This is mind-bogglingly stupid. Number 6, lack of corroborating witness testimony from nurses. It is suggested by Stonier that colleagues have given evidence against Lucy Letby, and Stonier even expects some sort of response from Lucy to this. In reality, no one from the Countess of Chester provided any such evidence. The case was indeed passed to the police with no evidence. Furthermore, Lucy's nursing team were broadly supportive of her, and it is known from Thirlwall documents that no one had seen anything suspicious, nor did they have any suspicions, let alone did they provide any evidence against her. Number 7. Grievance procedure contextually ignored. It is evident again from this interview that Cheshire Police completely ignored the grievance procedure and all of the context related to this, while allowing the subject of that grievance procedure at the hospital, Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam, to walk into the police station, essentially feed them a cock and bull story, which they swallowed completely uncritically. In fact, the only reasonable thing that Breary did say was that they needed to do a multidisciplinary review. This was repeated by the National Crime Agency and Cheshire Police, still singularly failed to do this. Number 8. Inability to recognise red flags. There were numerous red flags which indicated that Lucy Letby was not behaving suspiciously and that she was giving an honest account of what occurred on the unit. Danielle Stonier was yet another person within Cheshire Police who completely missed all of these things, even though subconsciously she had recognised them. She openly stated that interviewing Lucy Letby was surreal, and that is because deep down she knows that the accusations don't make any sense and that Lucy Letby wasn't presenting like a guilty person. Unfortunately, her conscious mind was unable to recognise this. Number 9. No motive identified and complete inability to intuitively discern anything. In accordance with this, the police are completely unable to suggest any form of motives, and it appears that they have no intuitive ability to discern anything because almost every assertion made by Danielle Stonier is incorrect and often completely illogical. Number 10. Lack of transparency. I will finally mention that there is a lack of transparency around the investigation, not least because only a very small portion of police interviews are available. Furthermore, we learned very little about the process of interviewing in this podcast, although Liz and Caroline must bear the brunt of responsibility for that, having failed to ask any relevant questions. So that is a summary of this interview where we learned a lot of interesting things about Cheshire Police, although essentially a lot of things that we already knew were reiterated. Danielle Stonier didn't contradict anything that we knew previously. We learned some new tidbits, but everything that we believed to be true was further reinforced by her performance in this podcast. Finally, I just wanted to mention that you can sign up for my book on the Lucy Letby case that will be released in June 2026. I will leave a link for the sign-up page, which is with Cinto Press, in the comment section. I'll pin a comment at the top of the comment section. I will be providing more details about this as we know more and as things develop. But if people could sign up for it, would be greatly appreciated. But you'll have plenty of opportunity to pre-order and purchase the book in the future. Thank you for watching and thank you for your ongoing support.